Flaxborough, on the morning of its annual flower and produce show, possessed that peculiar blend of orderly pride and latent competitiveness that only a small English market town could muster. Bunting fluttered over the high street, bunting that had clearly seen a dozen summers too many, and the scent of carnations mingled awkwardly with the faint tang of diesel from the delivery vans parked near the market hall. Mrs. Hortense Pigott, chairwoman of the Horticultural Committee, fussed over the arrangement of dahlias with the meticulous care of a woman accustomed to being admired and occasionally feared. She did not notice, of course, that her spectacles had slid askew, or that her gloved fingers were smudging the petals she so carefully aligned. She was, as always, invested in appearances. It was in this precise moment that the incident occurred, though it was so understated that most observers barely realized anything was amiss until the inevitable gossip began. A scream, soft, almost choked, came from the back of the hall. It belonged to young Miss Agatha Lenton, a timid girl whose fingers trembled as she placed her chrysanthemums on the display table. She was pointing at something, though what exactly she had seen was initially uncertain. "Oh, heavens!" cried Mrs. Pigott, clasping her hands to her chest in the sort of performance that had saved many a social disaster in her 59 years of civic engagement. By the time Inspector Purbright arrived, a quiet, unassuming man with the look of someone perpetually half surprised by the world, crowds had begun to gather. There was no shouting, no violent thrashing of arms, only a murmur of disquiet, as though the townsfolk had caught a whiff of trouble and were sniffing politely for confirmation. Purbright made his way through the clusters of whispered conjecture, noting small details as he always did. The faint smear of mud on a prize-winning lily, a pair of shoes that did not quite match the owner's coat, the faint scent of peppermint lingering on someone's handkerchief. He smiled faintly at the subtle choreography of minor panic, recognizing it as the overture of town gossip. He finally reached the scene at the rear of the hall. There, sprawled with an almost careless negligence upon the linoleum floor, was the body of a small, fragile-looking child. The room had not descended into chaos. Even now the onlookers maintained their distance with an almost genteel restraint. One could admire the civility of Flaxborough, he reflected, even in the face of potential tragedy. "Miss Lenton," Purbright said, crouching slightly to meet her wide, frightened eyes. "What have you seen?" I only came to see—" Her voice trailed off, stifled by the faint memory of the horror she had glimpsed. Purbright's gaze swept the hall with a quiet deliberation. There were no overturned chairs, no signs of struggle, no visible injuries that might explain the suddenness of death. And yet the child was undeniably gone. "It seems unfortunate," he murmured aloud, more to himself than to anyone else. He noted the particular quiet of the room, the way the townsfolk were speaking in hushed, almost ceremonial tones. There was dignity here, yes, but also the kind of restraint that often concealed secrets. By the time the coroner arrived, efficient, brisk, and professionally unemotional, speculation had already begun to take root. Mrs. Pigott whispered to the town council that perhaps the child's mother had been negligent, while Mr. Ellsworth, the local baker, suggested that some minor misadventure with the hall's heating system could not be ruled out. Each theory, of course, carried with it a subtle indictment, a miniature scandal hidden beneath the veneer of civility. Purbright, standing slightly apart, allowed the whispers to wash over him. He did not intervene, nor did he guide the conversation. His patience, as always, was infinite. He made mental notes, the position of the child's small shoes, the peculiar tension in Mrs. Pigott's fingers, the faint scent of almonds that no one else seemed to notice. Small, almost trivial, and yet potentially significant. As the town debated in muted tones, Purbright reflected on the nature of Flaxborough's civility. There was a rhythm here, he thought, a predictable choreography of social etiquette, of restrained passions and carefully concealed resentments, and somewhere, hidden beneath the polished manners and polite smiles, lay the truth of what had occurred. He would find it, but not today. For the moment there was only the quiet observation of a town caught off balance, the faint rustle of leaves outside the hall, and the precise, patient mind of Inspector Purbright, recording every twitch, glance, and half-spoken word. Tomorrow he would begin his inquiries. Today he simply watched and waited. The next morning Flaxborough awoke to a peculiar stillness. The high street, normally alive with the gentle rattle of shop shutters and the polite bustle of early shoppers, seemed muted, as though the previous day's shock had seeped into the cobblestones themselves. Conversation, when it occurred, came in careful fragments, a passing remark about the flower show, a fleeting question about the child, always hedged with apologies, almost as though speaking too freely might rouse the incident from memory. By mid-morning, gossip had begun to take shape, spreading with the quiet persistence of ivy across brickwork. In the snug back room of the King's Arms, where the newspaper lay half open on the worn oak table, Mrs. Harbottle, the postmistress, leaned over her tea to tell Mr. Peasy, the local grocer, everything she had heard, or rather, everything she believed she had heard. Her eyes darted nervously, convinced that the world contained listeners at every turn. "They say," she whispered, "that the child's mother was last seen arguing with the hall steward about the table arrangements. One can imagine how upset she might have been." Mr. Peasy nodded sagely, though he had seen little himself. "Indeed, indeed. And the steward, poor man, was flustered enough as it was. Such responsibility! One can hardly expect a calm mind in these circumstances." He shook his head slowly, as though the mere contemplation of the scene could spoil his digestion. Both seemed to take some satisfaction in discussing the matter with polite restraint, which of course magnified the drama all the more. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, observed without comment. He had arrived shortly after dawn to examine the hall once more, noting that the child's small shoes remained precisely where they had fallen, and that the faint smell of almonds lingered still. He allowed the townsfolk their conjectures, nodding politely when approached, making no effort to interrupt. Observation, he thought, was far more revealing than assertion. He began with the hall's regular attendants. Mr. Linton, the steward, was a man of habitual caution and almost comic nervousness, eager to speak, yet careful with each word. I did everything I could," he stammered. "Tables arranged, flowers placed. Nothing untoward, I assure you." Purbright's gaze lingered, noting the slight tremor in Linton's hand, the way he avoided direct eye contact when asked about his routine inspections, not a confession certainly, but an interesting wrinkle. Next he spoke to Mrs. Linton, the child's mother. She greeted him with a pale smile, carefully restrained, that spoke more of fear than grief. "Inspector," she said, "it was just a moment. I left her to look at the dahlias. I never imagined—" Her voice faltered, and she clasped her hands tightly, a gesture more telling than words. Purbright noticed the tension at the corners of her eyes, the subtle quickening of her breath. She spoke with honesty, yet there was something in her posture that hinted at layers unspoken. The townspeople, of course, had already begun forming their own conclusions. Mrs. Piggott, now safely removed from the immediate vicinity of the hall, offered her opinion with the calm authority of someone long accustomed to shaping events from behind a veneer of courtesy. "It is, I dare say, an unfortunate accident," she pronounced, to anyone who would listen, yet the tilt of her head suggested she found it difficult to believe entirely. "Still," she added with a polite sigh, one must be careful not to spread panic unnecessarily. Purbright noted all of this, recording not just the words, but the intervals between them, the hesitation in speech, the careful balancing of civility against suspicion. Each fragment of conversation added to the invisible lattice of motives and possibilities. By afternoon, another detail had emerged, trivial yet oddly persistent. The child's favorite toy, a small wooden horse, was missing from the scene. Not lost in the chaos of the hall, apparently, but absent entirely. It was the kind of detail that might seem inconsequential to everyone else, but would, Purbright suspected, prove to be quietly illuminating. A toy gone missing could suggest a struggle or a distraction, or simply the child's last movement before the unforeseen event. Nothing more than a detail, but as he had learned over the years, details like this often whispered truths louder than any confession. Meanwhile, a second, minor incident occurred that only served to further complicate matters. Mrs. Crump, who ran the town's flower shop, reported that a batch of prize orchids had been mysteriously watered late in the evening, leaving the petals soggy and the soil oversaturated. A minor act, but one noted for its peculiarity. Why, Purbright wondered, would someone bother to water another person's prized orchids in such a manner? It seemed almost purposeless, yet nothing in Flaxborough ever truly was. The inspector returned home at twilight, reflecting on the day's observations. Flaxborough's rhythms continued, even amidst uncertainty. The bakery closed promptly at 5, children ran down the high street under watchful eyes, and the townsfolk murmured about the flower show, the child, and the absent toy, as though rehearsing lines in a play they all knew by heart. Purbright, sitting quietly with his ledger open, considered human nature, the capacity for small cruelties, for careless lapses, for hidden anxieties cloaked in civility. He knew the next steps required subtlety. Direct questions could unbalance those whose guilt was not yet apparent. Too much pressure, and the truth might retreat further into shadow. Instead, he would observe, allow suspicions to crystallize naturally, and guide the guilty toward revelation with careful, polite nudges. As night settled over Flaxborough, its gas lamps casting long, thoughtful shadows across the cobblestones, Purbright felt the familiar quiet certainty. The town's surface calm was deceptive. Somewhere beneath its orderly routines, the truth waited, patient, understated, and wholly human. And tomorrow, he would begin to uncover it. The following morning, Inspector Purbright arrived at the Lenton residence with his usual unobtrusive precision. The house was modest, a neat row of brickwork with lace curtains drawn in careful symmetry, and the garden meticulously weeded. Mrs. Lenton greeted him at the door, her composure now more polished, though her hands betrayed the faint tremor of unresolved fear. "Good morning, Inspector," she said, offering him tea, which he accepted with the faintest nod. He noted the small, careful gestures of hospitality, the precise placement of the cups, the tilt of the saucer, the quiet hum of the kettle. Nothing escaped his observation. "Mrs. Lenton," Purbright began, in that calm, methodical tone that always encouraged confession without pressure. "I hope you slept somewhat after yesterday's event?" He allowed the pause to stretch, giving her time to collect herself. "I should like to ask a few questions, if you would permit it." She nodded, and they settled at the small kitchen table. Purbright's questions were polite, almost conversational. "Where were you when you last saw your daughter?" "I was arranging my exhibits," she replied softly. "I left her to look at the dahlias. Perhaps for 5 minutes, no more." Her eyes, though steady, flickered at the corners, betraying the effort of maintaining calm. "And the child's favorite toy?" he asked gently. "The small wooden horse?" Mrs. Lenton's face momentarily drained of color. I noticed it was missing only after After it was too late, I cannot imagine where it went. Her hands clenched reflexively. Purbright made a mental note. The toy's absence was clearly on her mind, yet she offered no immediate explanation. He next visited Mr. Linton, the hall steward. The man's nervous energy had not diminished. He wrung his hands as he spoke. "Inspector, I assure you, everything was in order. I supervised the tables, checked the arrangements, and the children were under parental supervision. Nothing could have gone wrong under my watch." Purbright noted the insistence, the quick breaths, the slight avoidance of eye contact. "Did anyone approach you about the placement of the displays?" he asked. Yes, Mrs. Piggott herself." Linton hesitated, then continued. She made suggestions very strongly, and I did as I was told. I thought it best to comply rather than argue." Here Purbright paused, considering the layers of obedience, pride, and social expectation at play. It was not unusual for Flaxborough's citizens to defer to Mrs. Piggott, yet the over-eagerness might conceal something more than mere civility. Over the next few hours, Purbright quietly interviewed a handful of other attendees. The ever-watchful Mrs. Crump, whose orchids had been oddly overwatered, Mr. Ellsworth, the baker, who had a reputation for long memories and grudges, and a young apprentice at the hall who had seen nothing but recalled everything with the naive clarity of youth. Each interview added fragments, minor discrepancies in timing, a hint of avoidance, a glance held too long. By mid-afternoon, Purbright returned to the market hall, walking slowly among the exhibits, observing the faint disturbances left behind by yesterday's incident. The child's shoes were moved to a small tray, ostensibly for safekeeping, yet even this arrangement seemed oddly precise, as if someone had thought to tidy up an accident that should have remained chaotic. It was in this moment, standing amidst the orderly displays, that he noticed the trivial yet peculiar detail that would quietly guide his thoughts. A smear of mud on the hem of Mrs. Lenton's dress, almost invisible, yet present enough to catch the light. It was the sort of thing a mother might acquire while attending to a child, but it was out of place if she had been solely arranging flowers at the hall's rear. Purbright's mind, as always, worked patiently, layering observation upon observation, waiting for patterns to reveal themselves. For now, the outward appearances were maintained: civility, routine, polite speculation. Yet beneath, a subtle dissonance persisted. By evening, the town had settled into its familiar rhythm, though whispers lingered, and cautious glances were exchanged. Purbright sat at his desk, noting each interview, every minor anomaly, and each carefully spoken word. He reflected on human nature in Flaxborough, the tiny acts of negligence or spite, the social pressures that disguised truth, the etiquette that both concealed and revealed. He understood that tomorrow's inquiries would require a delicate nudge, a question posed with such civility that it would unsettle those who had something to hide. He would allow the town's own habits, their gossip, their pride, their petty rivalries, to lead him forward. And, somewhere, amidst the polite facades and quiet murmurs, the truth awaited, patient as ever. By mid-morning, the town of Flaxborough had settled into the curious rhythm that follows a scandal, the sort that is both understated and insistent. Conversations were hushed, yet widespread, polite smiles concealing the careful prying of eyes. Even the shopkeepers, usually absorbed in ledgers or the precise arrangement of goods, found themselves speaking softly about the incident at the flower show. Inspector Purbright made his way to the home of Mrs. Piggott, the indefatigable chairwoman of the Horticultural Committee. She received him in the sitting-room, where doilies were pressed into sharp, geometric perfection, and the scent of lavender filled the air. She welcomed him with the dignity of a woman accustomed to directing not only the arrangements of dahlias, but the opinions of the entire town. "Inspector," she began, in a voice that was both courteous and commanding. "I must say it is most distressing. One hopes such things do not recur in Flaxborough." Her eyes, however, betrayed a subtle intensity. They were alert, calculating, and perhaps slightly defensive. Purbright inclined his head politely. "Mrs. Piggott, I understand your position yesterday was quite strenuous. May I ask you a few questions regarding the flower show and the events surrounding the child?" "Certainly," she replied, settling with the air of someone prepared for both civility and scrutiny. "I merely did my duty. It is unfortunate that someone should misconstrue my involvement as anything else." She lifted a delicate finger to indicate her strong sense of propriety. Purbright began with the obvious, the timeline of events. Mrs. Piggott recounted the precise order of judging, her movements from one exhibit to another, and her final intervention with Mr. Linton regarding the placement of the chrysanthemums. Every detail was exact, every pause measured. And yet there was a faint tension in her voice when she mentioned directing the hall steward, a subtle edge that suggested the possibility of overreach. The townsfolk, in the meantime, had already formed their own conclusions. Gossip was swift. In the bakery, Mr. Ellsworth suggested with careful insinuation that Mrs. Piggott's insistence on the flower arrangements might have agitated the mother, creating a chain of events that led to tragedy. At the post office, Mrs. Harbottle relayed that she had overheard Mr. Linton muttering about Mrs. Piggott's strong hand in hall affairs. These narratives, polite yet pointed, converged upon a single, plausible figure, Mrs. Piggott herself. Purbright observed all of this without overt comment. The more the town leaned toward a tidy conclusion, the more certain he became that appearances were misleading. Yet he recorded every word, every glance, every carefully modulated gesture. Mrs. Piggott, for all her apparent composure, exhibited the tiniest inconsistencies, a hesitation before affirming the child's location, a rapid glance at the door when the topic of supervision arose. He next turned to Mr. Linton, whose deference to Mrs. Piggott was now more pronounced, almost apologetic. "She simply insists on standards," he murmured, wringing his hands. "I do as I'm told. One must maintain harmony." Purbright noted the repeated emphasis on compliance and the slight tremor that accompanied each utterance. It was an understandable nervousness, yet he filed it away as potentially meaningful. Later, during a casual visit to the market hall, Purbright observed the position of the exhibits with meticulous attention. The flowers were pristine, the tables orderly, yet a subtle disturbance remained, the tray with the child's shoes, the empty space where the wooden horse had been placed, and the faint trace of mud at the rear exit. These minor details whispered of movement, of brief activity that contradicted Mrs. Piggott's narrative of continuous oversight. By evening, the pattern had solidified in the minds of the townsfolk. Mrs. Piggott, with her strong personality and assertive manner, had become the first obvious suspect in their eyes. Yet Purbright, patient as ever, withheld judgment. He recognized the allure of a neat solution, an authoritative figure, a single, socially prominent culprit, but he knew better than to accept appearances at face value. Returning to his desk, he reflected on the day's inquiries. The town had chosen a convenient narrative, one that allowed them to reconcile shock with civility. But human behavior, he noted, was rarely so accommodating. There were inconsistencies, subtle and carefully concealed, that did not fit the tidy account. And one trivial yet peculiar detail continued to occupy his mind: the child's missing wooden horse, absent from both the hall and Mrs. Lenton's account, a detail so small it might have been overlooked entirely by others. As he prepared to leave the hall for the night, Purbright considered his next move. Observation alone would not suffice. He would need a test, a gentle, polite maneuver designed to elicit a reaction, to probe the hidden layers of the town's social fabric. Only then could the truth, subtle and understated as it might be, emerge from beneath the polite facades. Flaxborough, calm in its evening glow, offered no indication of what lay beneath. Yet Purbright, as always, was ready to follow the whisper of evidence, patient in his watchfulness and confident in the quiet inevitability of discovery. The morning air in Flaxborough carried a damp freshness, the kind that made the cobblestones glisten and encouraged cautious walking. Inspector Purbright began his day at the market hall, returning once more to examine the scene with the meticulous patience that had become his hallmark. While the exhibits had been rearranged and the hall polished to a semblance of normality, certain details resisted the town's efforts at tidying. The tray with the child's shoes, now pushed carefully against a corner, and, most persistently, the absence of the small wooden horse. Purbright crouched beside the tray, observing the faint scuff marks that suggested movement across the floor. His trained eye caught something subtle, a fine trail of mud, almost invisible except for the way it caught the morning light. It led not toward the door, as might be expected if the child had wandered, but toward the hall's side exit, where the wooden horse had once been observed. He stood slowly, noting the angle and extent of the traces. Something about the pattern was quietly incongruous. Later, as he interviewed the hall's assistants and minor staff, he learned that no one had seen the toy being moved. It was an insignificant object, often overlooked, yet the child had treated it with unusual care. Its disappearance, Purbright realized, was neither accidental nor trivial. It was a subtle clue, one that might indicate the presence of another hand at work, a minor intrusion that had gone unnoticed in the general bustle. Returning to Mrs. Lenton, he allowed a casual conversation to unfold. "The toy," he said lightly, "is not here. Have you any recollection of where it might have gone?" She glanced down at her clasped hands, hesitant. I thought I saw it near the hall's rear. Her voice faltered. "It may have fallen, or someone may have picked it up. I did not notice." Her hesitation, though polite, was enough for Purbright to file it mentally. The phrasing suggested awareness tempered by caution, a subtle contradiction that hinted at layers beneath her composure. Across town, gossip took a quieter, more insistent turn. Mrs. Crump, whose orchids had been peculiarly overwatered, mentioned the missing horse to the postmistress with thinly veiled concern. "I did wonder," she said in measured tones, "if someone had taken it. It is not the sort of thing children leave unattended, especially one so fond of it." The observation was trivial, almost innocent, yet it carried an undertone of suspicion that Purbright had learned to respect. By afternoon he visited the hall's side exit, crouching to examine the floor with painstaking care. The mud trail was faint, yet distinct. It suggested not merely a child's movement, but that of a small adult, or perhaps a careful hand reaching and lifting. The detail was minor, almost laughably inconsequential, and yet in his experience such minutiae often held the key. He paused to reflect, as he often did, on human behavior and the peculiarities of Flaxborough's social order. People were polite, yes, and careful to maintain appearances, but within that civility existed impulses, small acts of concealment, subtle deviations from expected behavior. A toy moved, a flower overwatered, a glance held too long. These were the whispers of human truth. In the quiet of the hall, Purbright allowed himself a slow, measured smile. The toy, the mud, the overwatered orchids, they were minor threads, almost invisible when considered alone. Together, however, they began to form a lattice, a delicate pattern that suggested intervention rather than accident. The first obvious suspect, Mrs. Piggott, remained plausible to the town, yet the evidence, the quiet, understated evidence, was beginning to point elsewhere. By evening, he returned to his notes, assembling observations into a coherent framework. He reflected on the chain of events, linking each minor clue, the child's disappearance from sight, the missing toy, the inconsistent recollections, and the faint traces of movement. Each was trivial, yet collectively they suggested the hand of someone subtly involved, someone whose motives were human, restrained, and yet decisive. Purbright understood the rhythm of Flaxborough well. The town sought order, resolution, and a tidy explanation. Yet human nature, he knew, seldom adhered to such neatness. Truth, like the faint traces on the hall floor, required careful attention, patience, and observation. He would pursue it, step by step, until the inconsistencies and the oddities revealed their source. As the gas lamps lit the high street, casting long, deliberate shadows, Purbright prepared for the next day's inquiries. A second minor incident, he realized, might soon emerge, and with it the first genuine indication of the true sequence of events. The town, polite and orderly as ever, was unknowingly conspiring to display its own secrets. And he would be ready. The following morning, Flaxborough awoke under a pale, misted sun, the kind that softened edges and lent the high street an air of tentative civility. Inspector Purbright, as was his habit, began his rounds quietly, observing the subtle choreography of town life. Shopkeepers arranged goods with precise care, children skipped along the pavements under watchful eyes, and the usual hum of conversation carried beneath a veneer of restrained curiosity. Yet beneath this calm, the tendrils of yesterday's tragedy had begun to extend, drawing in townsfolk whose involvement was previously unsuspected. Purbright first called upon Mr. Ellsworth, the baker, whose long memory and social attentiveness made him an unexpected repository of local knowledge. Mr. Ellsworth, flour-dusted and wearing a smile that masked a faint tension, spoke eagerly but cautiously. "Inspector, I did notice something curious yesterday," he began. A young boy, Harvey Cranston, was lingering near the hall's rear exit shortly before the incident. Nothing untoward, of course, but he seemed unusually interested in the flower arrangements. Purbright noted the careful hedging of Ellsworth's words. The boy, he knew, was not previously under scrutiny, yet small children often served as unwitting witnesses or instruments of minor mischief. He thanked Ellsworth politely and filed the observation for later comparison. Next, he visited Mrs. Crump, who had already contributed to the minor drama with her overwatered orchids. Her shop, fragrant with lilies, and the faintly sour note of damp soil revealed a new dimension to the puzzle. "Inspector," she said, folding her hands carefully over the counter, "there was a gentleman in town, Mr. Tilling, the solicitor, asking questions about yesterday's show. He appeared concerned about insurance matters of all things and seemed unusually intent on details of the children's arrangements." Purbright raised a subtle eyebrow. A solicitor curious about a local flower show? Unremarkable on the surface, yet the combination of precise interest and polite probing could suggest a motive of oversight or interference. He made a note to speak with Mr. Tilling directly, recognizing that small towns often created intricate webs of connection in which minor figures could wield disproportionate influence. By midday, Purbright had expanded his field of enquiry to include not only the hall's attendants and the immediate family, but also peripheral actors, visiting judges of the flower show, a retired schoolteacher who had been observing the children's behavior, and even the postmistress, whose awareness of correspondence and communication made her a quiet but persistent node in the town's network. Each conversation revealed tiny inconsistencies, careful omissions, or subtle emphases. No single interview pointed decisively toward culpability, yet a pattern, almost imperceptible, was beginning to emerge. At the hall itself, he examined the exhibits once more. The child's shoes remained in their corner, and the absence of the wooden horse still occupied his attention. He noted, however, that the small trail of mud extended slightly farther than he had previously realized, almost as if retraced by a cautious observer or an adult moving with deliberate care. This, combined with the reports from Mr. Ellsworth and Mrs. Crump, hinted at the quiet involvement of additional actors who had previously escaped notice because their actions were minor, almost incidental. As afternoon waned, he turned his attention to social dynamics. Flaxborough's residents, he observed, had begun to realign themselves around yesterday's event. Those who were typically allied with Mrs. Piggott now whispered more cautiously, while others, previously unobtrusive, found subtle ways to assert opinions or convey suspicions. The social fabric itself, woven of politeness and routine, was shifting imperceptibly, responding to the intrusion of tragedy. Purbright reflected quietly in his notebook. Human behavior, particularly in small towns, revealed itself through minor disturbances, unguarded remarks, and slight inconsistencies in otherwise rehearsed civility. Each participant, no matter how peripheral, contributed a fragment to the mosaic of truth. And it was in these fragments, small, often contradictory, yet persistent, that the path toward understanding lay. As evening fell, Purbright returned to the market hall, wandering through the exhibits in the dimming light, the shadows cast by gas lamps stretched along the walls, merging with the subtle traces of movement, of objects displaced and then rearranged. He allowed himself a faint, patient smile. The investigation had widened, new threads had been drawn into view, and the quiet lattice of clues was beginning to take shape. Flaxborough, with its polite facades and orderly streets, remained outwardly unchanged, yet beneath its calm exterior the truth was stirring, ready to be revealed in its own subtle, meticulous time. And Inspector Purbright, as ever, was ready to follow it, step by careful step. It was mid-morning when the second disturbance arrived, subtle yet unmistakable, in Flaxborough. The town had been adapting to the quiet hum of resumed routine after the flower show tragedy, and the air itself seemed accustomed to whispers rather than exclamations. Yet this new incident, though minor in spectacle, caused a ripple across the high street that would prove significant to Inspector Purbright. The cause of the stir was a small fire at the back of the bakery, a smouldering incident quickly contained by Mr. Ellsworth himself with the help of a hastily summoned bucket brigade. No one was hurt, and the flames barely licked the timbers, yet the curious timing and precise location, behind the bakery, near the alley where the hall's deliveries passed, prompted speculation among the more attentive townsfolk. Purbright arrived shortly after, as always unobtrusive, noting the smell of smoke, the scattered ash, and the faint traces of mud that had been tracked from the market hall. There was no obvious connection, of course, but in Flaxborough, as he often reminded himself, coincidences were rarely mere coincidences. He spoke first to Mr. Ellsworth, who was both flustered and apologetic. "Inspector, it's nothing, truly, just a minor oversight with the oven. I was careless for a moment, and that's all." He wrung his flour-covered hands nervously, glancing at the alley as if expecting a reprimand from some unseen observer. "And the alley?" Purbright asked mildly. "Was there anything unusual about the deliveries or those who passed through here yesterday?" Ellsworth hesitated, then shook his head. "No, nothing, unless you count young Harvey Cranston loitering there again, though I dare say he was just curious." The repetition of this detail drew Purbright's attention anew. The boy had now appeared twice in positions of interest, both times in the vicinity of minor disturbances. Next he spoke to Mrs. Crump, who had arrived in person, concerned about the smoke and the effect it might have on her orchids. She mentioned in passing that she had seen Mr. Tilling, the solicitor, standing near the alley shortly before the fire. The solicitor had apparently been inspecting the rear of the hall's route, perhaps making notes, perhaps merely curious. His presence, though entirely plausible, added another layer to the growing lattice of suspicion. By afternoon, Purbright had begun mapping the movements and timings of various minor actors across the town. The boy, Harvey Cranston, the solicitor, Mr. Tilling, even the hall steward and Mrs. Piggott, all now appeared in overlapping arcs of observation. Each seemed innocent in isolation. Together the coincidences suggested attention worthy of discreet scrutiny. The child's missing toy, the faint mud trails, and now the unusual fire incident began to weave a subtler pattern. The first obvious suspect, Mrs. Piggott, whose strong personality had captured the town's attention, now seemed less directly implicated. Her actions were consistent, her presence accounted for, and she had no apparent reason to interfere in such indirect ways. Yet others, more peripheral, more careful, might be implicated in ways that had thus far eluded gossip and polite speculation. Purbright spent the late afternoon in reflection, walking the length of the high street and observing the subtle rhythms of the townsfolk. Children played with renewed caution, shopkeepers exchanged measured remarks, and the postmistress noted everything from behind her counter, eyes bright with curiosity. Flaxborough's civility persisted, yet beneath it the town had revealed new, quieter currents of human behavior, avoidance, hesitation, and subtle concealment. By evening he returned to the market hall, pausing once more by the corner where the child's shoes remained. The wooden horse was still absent, and the faint mud trail now carried additional significance. Someone had moved with intent, someone whose presence had been previously overlooked. The minor fire, while seemingly accidental, was now understood as part of a pattern, an event that highlighted movements and actions previously unnoticed, small signals in the otherwise polished surface of Flaxborough life. Purbright closed his notebook and sat quietly. The first suspect had been revealed to the town with ease, but she now seemed unlikely to bear the full burden of guilt. Instead, the investigation widened subtly the lattice of observation and minor incidents, pointing toward a more complex, understated human motive. Flaxborough, polite and orderly as ever, continued to hum, unaware that the truth had begun to assert itself in quiet, almost imperceptible ways. The evening settled over Flaxborough with a softness that contrasted sharply with the day's subtle turbulence. Gas lamps glimmered along the high street, casting elongated shadows across cobblestones, still damp from the morning mist. In the quiet of his office, Inspector Purbright sat with a small cup of tea, the steam curling in gentle, languid spirals. The events of the past week occupied his thoughts, as they always did, not in the form of frantic urgency, but as a precise puzzle demanding patience, observation, and careful reflection. He reviewed the incidents one by one, the sudden death of the child at the flower show, the minor fire at the bakery, the missing wooden horse, and the faint mud trails that linked them all. Each event, trivial in isolation, formed a pattern when considered in combination. Yet the pattern was not obvious, nor was it likely to be discerned by the townsfolk whose instincts favoured neat, convenient conclusions. Purbright reflected first on Mrs. Lenton, the child's mother. Her composure was remarkable, yet her body language had betrayed subtle tension, particularly when discussing the toy or the child's movements. Was it fear, grief, or perhaps the instinctive attempt to conceal some small error? He considered her personality, reserved, polite, anxious to conform to the town's expectations. She was a devoted mother, yes, but devotion did not preclude lapses, and lapses, in Purbright's experience, often spoke louder than declarations of innocence. Then there was Mrs. Piggott, whose assertiveness had initially made her the focus of town speculation. Yet her movements were accounted for, her involvement transparent, and her vigilance almost excessive. The town had been quick to fix blame upon her. The neatness of that narrative appealed to civic sensibilities, but Purbright, with his habitual caution, had noted the inconsistencies, or rather the lack thereof, that suggested she was unlikely to be the culprit. The minor actors, however, intrigued him more. Harvey Cranston, loitering near the hall, Mr. Tilling, the solicitor, whose attention to minor details suggested a curiosity that exceeded simple concern, and the hall staff, whose deference to authority often obscured minor transgressions. Each possessed potential for involvement, yet their motives remained murky, subtle, and typically overshadowed by the town's fixation on Mrs. Piggott. Purbright's reflections turned to human nature itself. People, he mused, were rarely capable of the dramatic villainy often suggested by novels or newspapers. Crime in Flaxborough was quiet, understated, hidden beneath the surface of civility and propriety. It emerged not in grand gestures, but in small acts, a neglected glance, a carefully placed object, an overlooked hesitation. And it was precisely in these minor deviations that truth could be discerned, provided one observed without judgment, without haste, and with an acute awareness of human frailty. He considered the missing wooden horse again, the faint trail of mud, and the subtle movements of those present during the flower show. Each tiny anomaly hinted at agency, intentionality, or inadvertent interference. And yet the solution was unlikely to lie with the obvious suspect, the figure so neatly framed by public opinion. Rather, it was the peripheral, almost invisible actors whose actions had shifted the course of events in ways unnoticed by the crowd. Sitting back, Purbright allowed himself a moment of mild amusement. The town's polite gossip, their insistence on convenient narratives, had created a smokescreen of civility. Beneath it, however, lay the quiet theatre of human motive. Small errors, cautious movements, and understated impulses, all converging upon a truth that waited patiently to be revealed. He made a final note in his ledger. Tomorrow he would introduce a subtle test, a deliberate, polite maneuver intended to elicit reaction and draw the guilty party into the open. It would be executed with civility, entirely consistent with Flaxborough's social expectations, yet it would reveal far more than direct questioning ever could. As the town's lamps flickered and the soft hush of night descended, Purbright understood that he was close to the threshold of understanding. The answer was not in spectacle or accusation, but in observation, patience, and the delicate orchestration of social cues. The truth, quiet and understated as ever, awaited the precise moment of revelation. The morning was crisp, the air carrying the faint scent of damp leaves and freshly baked bread. Flaxborough moved with its accustomed civility, the townsfolk engaged in polite routines, each careful to maintain appearances while whispering conjectures in subdued tones. Inspector Purbright, as always, observed silently, allowing the rhythms of the town to guide his approach. Today, he intended to introduce a subtle test, a delicate nudge designed to reveal more than words alone could convey. He began with a visit to Mrs. Lenton, ostensibly to inquire further about the exhibits and her arrangements at the flower show. "I was thinking," he said lightly, as they sat in the tidy kitchen, "that perhaps we might retrace the child's movements yesterday. Even small objects, like her wooden horse, might provide insight if we can recall the sequence carefully." His tone was conversational, almost casual, yet precise in its intent. Mrs. Lenton's eyes flickered, a brief hesitation barely perceptible. but enough for Purbright to note. "Yes, yes, of course," she replied. I remember placing her near the dahlias, and then she wandered a little, though I thought she remained in sight." She paused, hands clenching and unclenching. Purbright allowed the silence to linger, politely observing the subtle signs of tension, the shallow breath, the shifting of weight, the avoidance of direct eye contact. Later, he invited several minor actors to the market hall under the pretext of inspecting arrangements for an upcoming local event. Among them were Harvey Cranston, the boy who had been seen loitering near the hall, Mr. Tilling, the solicitor, and the hall's assistants. Purbright ensured that the group would naturally circulate near the areas associated with the previous incidents, allowing him to observe interactions, glances, and gestures. It was during this casual assembly that the test began to yield results. Harvey, under the watchful eye of Purbright, seemed increasingly restless, darting glances toward the corner where the child's shoes had been returned. Mr. Tilling, meanwhile, exhibited a faint, almost imperceptible tightening of the jaw whenever the toy or the child's route was mentioned. The hall assistants, diligent in their tasks, maintained an outward composure, yet Purbright noticed the slight hesitation when asked to demonstrate the arrangements from the previous week. Later, Purbright engaged Mrs. Lenton in private conversation once more. "The trail of mud," he said gently. "It might suggest a brief venture outside the hall." "Did anyone accompany your daughter, or might she have followed someone?" She swallowed, pausing for a moment that seemed longer than necessary. I thought she was alone," she said finally. "But perhaps someone else was near. I didn't see clearly." The careful ambiguity, the phrasing of her words, allowed Purbright to sense both honesty and a subtle concealment, a combination that often marked human error more than malice. Throughout the day, he noted each reaction, each micro-expression, and each minor inconsistency. The townsfolk remained polite, smiling, and accommodating, unaware that they were participating in a quiet orchestration designed to reveal truth through behavior rather than confession. Purbright, as ever, relied upon the nuances of human conduct, hesitation, repetition, avoidance, and the unguarded flicker of recognition. By evening, the cumulative effect of the day's subtle pressures became apparent. The initial narrative, centered on Mrs. Piggott, had begun to unravel. Peripheral actors, previously unconsidered, exhibited small signs of tension, minor contradictions, and slight adjustments in posture when topics relating to the child and the toy were mentioned. Purbright understood that the first suspect, neat and convenient though she seemed to, the public, would not bear the burden of guilt. Instead, the truth lay hidden among those whose actions had been minor, understated, yet consequential. Flaxborough, calm in its evening hush, was unaware that its polite routines had now revealed more than it realized. And Purbright, patient and quietly assured, recognized that the next day would bring the culmination of observation, subtle testing, and careful reflection, the moment when the truth would emerge in all its understated clarity. The morning was serene, the kind of soft, pale light that lent Flaxborough its habitual sense of order and civility. Inspector Purbright arrived at the market hall early alone to make the final preparations for the day's inquiries. The exhibits had been adjusted once more, chairs arranged for ease of observation, and the spaces through which the town's minor actors might pass had been subtly marked with faint visual cues, a glance here, a careful positioning there, enough to draw reactions without obvious interference. He had decided upon a calm, civil setting for the eventual revelation. The town's library, a quiet room of polished wood and orderly shelves, where individuals could be invited without undue attention, and where manners would prevail over spectacle. Flaxborough, after all, appreciated subtlety. By mid-morning, the key participants were assembled under the pretext of reviewing arrangements for a forthcoming local charity event. Mrs. Lenton, Mr. Tilling, Harvey Cranston, the hall assistants, and even Mrs. Piggott, who had been graciously included to maintain appearances, were present. Each assumed the gathering was a matter of routine oversight. Purbright began the discussion in his customary understated manner. He referenced the flower show, the minor incidents, and the town's general adherence to civility, all while observing expressions and micro-reactions with careful precision. He asked gentle questions, posed hypothetical scenarios, and allowed silences to linger just long enough to provoke reflection or tension. Finally, he addressed the wooden horse. "It is remarkable," he said lightly, "how the smallest objects can reveal so much. A toy moved, a trail of mud, and suddenly the entire chain of events takes shape." He paused, allowing the group a moment to consider this observation. Eyes shifted. Subtle adjustments in posture betrayed discomfort. Turning gently toward Mrs. Lenton, he said, "You were diligent, attentive, and devoted. Yet, in that brief interval when you attended to the arrangements, the child, your daughter, wandered beyond your immediate observation. The toy, placed carefully nearby, was lifted not by malice, but by curiosity and oversight." He looked briefly at Harvey Cranston, who shifted uneasily, the boy's cheeks flushing faintly. "Harvey, you followed the child at the hall's rear, did you not?" Purbright asked, his tone conversational, yet precise. "Curiosity, naturally, but with consequences neither intended nor foreseen." The boy nodded slightly, eyes downcast as though understanding for the first time the gravity of a minor action. "And the minor fire at the bakery?" Purbright continued, addressing Mr. Tilling with polite formality. "An accident, yes, yet its timing inadvertently highlighted movements and traces that had otherwise escaped notice." Mr. Tilling adjusted his glasses, acknowledging the observation without comment, his expression a mixture of relief and slight embarrassment at the unintended consequences of his presence. Finally, Purbright regarded the room calmly. "No one acted with malice," he said. "The tragedy that occurred was a result of a momentary lapse, a series of minor actions, and the subtle interplay of human behavior. It is a reminder that even in the most ordered communities, small deviations unseen, unintended, can produce profound effects." The room remained silent for a moment, the gravity of understatement sinking in. Mrs. Piggott, initially a suspect in the eyes of the town, exhaled with quiet relief, and Mrs. Lenton, though still grief-stricken, understood that her attentiveness had not been at fault. Flaxborough, for all its polite assumptions, had been guided toward understanding by patience, observation, and subtle civil inquiry. Purbright allowed the assembly to disperse at their leisure. Each participant departed with a newfound awareness, a gentle reshaping of perspective, and a quiet acknowledgement of the delicate nature of truth. The town's social equilibrium remained intact, though enriched with the knowledge that civility, observation, and patience were as powerful as any formal investigation. As he returned to his office, Purbright reflected with mild satisfaction. The web of small-town behavior, minor lapses, and human curiosity had been unraveled gently, methodically, and without spectacle. Everything had been accounted for, the incidents, the minor actors, the trivial yet significant clues. Flaxborough would continue, polite and orderly, yet now with an implicit recognition of the delicate balance underlying its apparent calm. Purbright sat at his desk, returned the ledger to its neat stack, and allowed himself a quiet cup of tea. The truth had been revealed, subtly, civilly, and comprehensively. All that remained was the town's gentle resumption of its routine, the silent acknowledgement that even minor details could ripple outward, shaping lives in quiet, unforeseen ways. Flaxborough awoke under a pale, steady light, the town moving with its usual precision and civility. The flower show, now a week past, had faded from immediate memory, leaving only subtle ripples in conversation. Shops opened, the high street filled with measured bustle, and children, including Harvey Cranston, returned to play with an unspoken caution in their steps. Politeness, as always, remained paramount, yet beneath the surface, awareness lingered. Minor actions carried consequences, small lapses could ripple outward, and civility often masked a more delicate truth. Inspector Purbright arrived at his office in the quiet of morning, noting the familiar sequence of familiar tasks, ledger in place, letters sorted, daily reports awaiting attention. The events of the past week had resolved neatly, civilly, and without scandal beyond what polite society could tolerate. Yet he reflected, as was his habit, on the deeper implications. The child's death, though tragic, had resulted from inadvertence rather than malice. The minor fire at the bakery, the misplacement of the toy, and the subtle behaviors of minor actors all conspired to create an appearance more tangled than the reality. The townsfolk, for their part, resumed routines with a sense of cautious normality. Mrs. Piggott returned to her meticulously arranged flower beds, her reputation restored quietly in the collective imagination. Mrs. Lenton, though still touched by grief, continued her domestic routines with the dignity and composure for which she was known, mindful now of the small, unpredictable ways in which human behavior intersected with everyday life. Harvey Cranston moved carefully, no longer a figure of casual curiosity, but aware, subtly, of his own capacity to influence outcomes. Purbright spent the morning reviewing his notes, observing the habitual patterns of the town with patient attention. Each minor detail, the alignment of shop fronts, the spacing of benches, the careful arrangement of plants along the market hall, revealed the town's persistent adherence to order and civility. Yet, within this order, he recognized the quiet truths that governed human behavior: hesitation, curiosity, inadvertent interference, and the understated forces that shape outcomes. By afternoon, he took a brief walk along the high street, acknowledging townsfolk with a polite nod or a slight smile. Conversations resumed in measured tones, gossip tempered by civility, and the social equilibrium, though subtly altered, had regained its natural rhythm. Flaxborough, outwardly unchanged, had internalized a faint awareness of how delicate the balance of its ordered life truly was. Returning to his office, Purbright set aside his coat and prepared for the next day's work, confident that the resolution had been thorough and discreet. He reviewed the minor clues, the subtle tests, and the eventual reveal, noting with satisfaction how each element had contributed to understanding without need for drama or spectacle. The town had learned gently and imperceptibly that truth could be revealed through observation, civility, and patience, and that even minor actors played roles whose significance might only be appreciated in retrospect. As evening fell, gas lamps flickered along the cobblestones, and the town settled into a calm rhythm. Children's laughter echoed faintly in the distance, shopkeepers closed for the day, and Flaxborough's polite civility reasserted itself fully. Purbright, seated at his desk with the quiet comfort of order restored, allowed a final note in his ledger before turning off the lamp. The investigation had concluded, the threads of human behavior traced and understood, and the town's equilibrium quietly preserved. In Flaxborough, life would continue in its customary measured fashion, marked only by the subtle knowledge that even the smallest actions could ripple outward and shape events in unforeseen ways. Inspector Purbright, patient and observant as ever, returned to his paperwork, the faint smile of satisfaction upon his lips.